People will come back from lunch, and we're about to start the second part of our presentations with the team called Confidence Estimation for Statistical Machine Translation. And George here will tell us all about it.
Right.
George,
That's me. So the first observation I want to make is that in contrast to Fred's assertion of this morning, we are actually countable. And even better than that, we're finite. So we consist of 3 senior members, 3 grad students, and 2 undergrads. And our topic is confidence estimation for MT. So it's a very easy problem to describe. The idea is just to assign correctness or not to translation. So for example, if we see a translation like this, where assuming that this strange sentence here corresponds to the weather is always perfect in Baltimore, we want to say, yeah, it's right, and ideally assign maybe a score to that judgment. And if we see something like this, which is more typical of MT output, we'd like to say, no, that's not good. So this is about making judgments about individual translations. The name is a bit unfortunate because it leads people to think that it's about confidence bounds or statistical significance, but it's not the same thing. So why are we interested in this problem? Well, confidence estimation is useful for practical applications of imperfect NLP technologies, and most NLP technologies are imperfect. So the idea is if you can't get the right answer, it's at least useful to know that you're wrong, and particularly if you're directly interacting with users. And there's been extensive previous work in this field in speech recognition, which is arguably the most mature, technologically mature field of NLP, and especially in spoken dialogue systems. So if you're going to allow yourself the chance of prompting a user for confirmation of an utterance that you think you might not have heard, you want to be right about that. You don't want to just do it indiscriminately because you're going to annoy a lot of users. But apart from speech recognition, there's very little work in this field and other areas of NLP. So the motivation for the workshop is to apply confidence estimation techniques to another challenging NLP problem and see how we do and see what kind of conclusions we can draw from this. Right away, we're faced with 2 big problems applying confidence estimation to MT. And the first is, well, what we'd like to do is study the behavior of an MT system on some data. And we'd like to have that be labeled according to whether the output is correct or not. But it's very difficult to automatically assign correct or incorrect tags to MT output. And of course, it's very expensive, and it's also difficult to do so manually. And this is basically because for any given source sentence, the set of correct translations is enormous and somewhat ill-defined. So it's interesting to contrast this to speech recognition. In speech recognition, you arguably have many correct answers. So for example, here are 2 answers that you could consider correct if someone says January 12th, 1999, but they tend to be related in very simple ways. So there's a kind of a linear relationship, and you can do some kind of normalization to get at the right answer. That's not at all the case in MT, of course. You can have syntactic inversions, all kinds of transformations. Basically, any paraphrase of the correct sentence is a reasonable translation. So if you know one correct translation, that only gives you very weak clues about the others. So this is the essential famous MT evaluation problem. And it's even worse for us than it is for MT because we're interested in working at the sentence level. And these measures, automatic evaluation measures, exhibit a lot of variability at the sentence level. So MT typically, as you saw in the presentation this morning, you work with some kind of measure, some kind of average or measure computed over a whole text, and there's a lot less variability there. But whole text confidence estimation is not very interesting. If we're going to make a sort of a binary judgment on the text level, there are fewer applications for that sort of thing than making it at the sentence level. And MT works at the sentence level anyway. So that's the first problem. The second big problem with confidence estimation for MT is that MT output is very bad, as you also saw this morning. So we could do really well in this confidence estimation problem by just saying no all the time. So here are a lot of the sort of examples, a few of the sort of examples that you saw this morning. You can kind of get what the system is driving at, and it might be useful for some applications, but in no way would you say that any of these constitutes a correct translation. So, but in a natural definition, you wouldn't call these correct. So here are solutions to these two problems. And I put solutions in quotes because these are imperfect solutions. This is the best we could do. For the evaluation problem, we went through an exercise where we assessed automatic error metrics, a whole bunch of them, on hand-annotated data that we created ourselves in an exercise involving all the participants of the workshop. So to try to get an idea of what the variability really was at the sentence level and which measure would best reflect true translation quality. So that's our solution to the first problem, and our solution to the second problem is to redefine correctness as having an error threshold, according to some automatic measure, below a certain level. So really the exercise here is to distinguish between only slightly bad translations and very bad translations. And the justification for this is to say that different error thresholds may correspond to different potential applications. So a very low threshold, where you're just interested in getting the keywords right, would be useful for something like cross-language information retrieval. Below that, it's completely useless for any application. A step up the ladder, you might kind of get some rough idea of the source sentence from the translation, so this could be useful for gisting. Higher up, you get into post-editing and so forth. So the idea is we're trying to learn on these thresholds with the hope that they'll be useful in some application. So here's our basic setup. We're trying to learn the behavior of the statistical machine translations group's base system that you heard about this morning on a corpus that's separate from the one on which it was trained. And then we want to test the goodness of our confidence estimates on a separate corpus again. So we start with a set of raw examples that look like this. We have a source sentence, a list of n-best hypotheses, and a set of reference translations. And for each one of these, we transform it into n examples of this form here. So we use this threshold on our error measure, and we basically just say, well, if the hypothesis has an error that's lower than the threshold, we call it right, otherwise we call it wrong. So we just generate a tagged set of examples from the n-best list like this. And we do some experiments, and we test on the corpus.
What is an S again?
Source sentence.
Oh, okay. Oh, Chinese, right?
Right, and the C here is just the correct tag. It's wisely.
So does that mean for the whole summer you work with one threshold?
No. No. We worked with a couple different thresholds, and we sort of studied which ones were interesting, and we'll talk about that more later. Yeah.
Does that tau depend on the source sentence, or?
No. No. That's an interesting question, but no, we use a fixed one. Okay, so basically we performed experiments at two levels of granularity, the sentence level and sub-sentence level. And for each we investigated different methods involving different features and different learning techniques, and we evaluated using two basic methods, task independent, which is sort of a basic measure of how good our confidence estimates are, independent of any particular application, and then we also tried out some applications for this, because after all, that's what we'd like to go for. Okay, so granularities. Sentence level confidence estimation is basically what I was describing. We want to learn from this kind of fuzzy match as captured by the error metric between the translation that we're studying and the set of reference translations. So if we can do this, there's a number of applications you can imagine. Model combinations, so you do confidence estimation on one MT system and you do it on another MT system, and then you can, given a hypothesized translation, you can ask each what its probability of correctness, what probability of correctness it assigns to that, and then output the highest probability hypothesis. Another applications re-ranking, where you just want to, it's essentially what the MT group was describing this morning. We're not attacking that problem directly, but it is a side effect of what we're doing. And we can also imagine filtering for post-editing. So this is the kind of thing I was mentioning earlier, where you're interested in retaining sentences that are above a certain level of quality and throwing away the rest. And finally, we could also possibly do some sort of active learning where we generate a corpus of hard translation examples using the ones that we assign, our system assigns low probability to, and have them corrected by a human in some way. The starred ones here are the applications we actually tested. Okay, so sub-sentence confidence estimation is quite different. We're not, here we're interested in learning from an exact match between some word in our translation we're studying and a corresponding word in the reference translation. So the idea is we're trying to tag words within translations here instead of tagging whole sentences as correct or not. And the applications are a bit more speculative in this case. We could do highlighting for post-editing, so trying to highlight some region of the translation as being bad, and then you have a human translator come along afterwards and correct just that region, if you can do that accurately. And another one is hypothesis recombination. So, for instance, if we have a bunch of hypotheses in an NBEST list, and we can do sub-sentence confidence estimation accurately, we basically have a bunch of little fragments. And we might be able to use confidence measures on these fragments to splice together parts of the NBEST list to create hypotheses that weren't in the original NBEST list. And this is something that actually works for speech recognition. So you can go along and calculate basically word posterior probabilities or other confidence measures over an NBEST list. And if you just pick say the most probable word at each position, that can give you better results than a base system. But because of the reordering problem in MT, it's much less obvious how you do that. So you can have basically a word that's scattered over all the hypotheses, and it occurs so often that it might be the most probable word at each position, so you end up proposing AAA in the same word repeated all over again. So you have to constrain that somehow. Okay, so the methods, we are interested in trying out a bunch of features. We used about an order of magnitude fewer features than the MT group, but then again, we're a finite group, so it's okay. And we tried out different machine learning techniques. So the simplest is just to use none. We use some statistic or a posterior probability derived from the baseline model, and we use that to rank translation hypotheses according to their quality. And we also tried an approach where we sit a separate machine learning layer on top of the base system to try to learn its performance in different contexts. And so this is similar to the idea of stacking in machine learning. And it has basically chiefly modularity advantages over just using the baseline model. So if we build this extra layer, it's possible we can retrain it for different domains or even reuse it for different systems. And it lets us separate the problem of picking the best solution from the problem of just determining its correctness. So it's possible that features that help us are not going to be very good for MT. And we'll describe some of those later in the presentation. And the two main machine learning methods we tried were naive Bayes and neural nets. Okay, so how do we do task-independent evaluation? Well, there's sort of two flavors of confidence estimation, which I call weak and strong. And weak, you're just interested in making binary correctness judgments. So you're basically building a binary classifier that, given a source sentence and a target sentence, says yes or no. And of course, to use a classifier like that in an actual application, you would want to tune it so that it optimizes the expected cost for that application. So in order that the evaluation reflects the performance of that classifier across different tuning thresholds, you use a technique such as ROC curves, which we use to sort of evaluate the classifier across all ranges of sort of priors, if you like. And I want to stress that this tuning threshold here is not to be confused with the error threshold that defines our problem in the first case that I was talking about earlier. This is just an intrinsic property of the classifier that lets us kind of evaluate that classifier. And ROC curves are nice. They give you a kind of a picture of what classifier may be better than another, but they don't give you a single number, so you can take the integral under the curve to give you one number that ideally will reflect the quality of the classifier that you've built. Okay, so this is weak confidence estimation. Strong confidence estimation, you directly estimate probabilities of correctness. And this is much more broadly applicable because you don't need to tune it. If you can estimate accurate probabilities, then you can plug it into any sort of cost matrix and figure out the best solution. So to evaluate this, we can also use the same kind of discriminability metrics that we use for weak confidence estimation, or we can use direct estimates of how good the probabilities are. We want some kind of measure of the distance between the distribution we estimate and the actual distribution, so we use cross entropy. All right, so we tried these two applications for evaluation as well. Model combination, where we basically used probabilities of correctness to combine outputs from the baseline statistical machine translation that you heard about this morning and an MT system that the people at Carnegie Mellon were kind enough to lend us. Well, they lent us the output. They gave us the output. And then we also tried re-ranking, using these correctness probabilities or just the actual threshold to reorder hypotheses and index lists. Okay, so that's it for the introduction. Here's what the rest of the presentation looks like. Cyril will describe the experimental setups and the machine learning techniques. Then we'll describe sentence level experiments. Aaron will describe our features. I'll talk about the task independent results at the sentence level. Simona will talk about the application evaluations. Nicola will then describe all the sub-sentence level experiments that we did. And finally, Alex will talk about the user evaluation trial.
And when is there a break?
There is a break.
After sentence.
There's a
Just
break.
raise your hand.
Okay, that's fast.
We could be flexible then.
Okay.
All right. So.
Okay, so I'll spend some time trying to describe the experimental setup that we used. So this is mostly for describing some technical issues like the models we used, the corpus we used. There's no results in this section. So I will start with the some corpus issues. So problem of learning with so much data and how we dealt with it in practice. Then how we formulate this correctness estimation, the problem of estimating the probability that a sentence is correct in terms of a machine learning problem. I'll describe the naive-Bayes model that we used during the experiment, the neural networks model that we used, and some relationship with the maximum entropy technique. And I will briefly presents the technique we use for deriving error bars on some of the performance measures that we will present. Okay. So the corpus we use is basically consists of the output of two different systems that were used in this year's ListMT evaluation on the Chinese English task. So it's very related to the data that the MT team used for obvious reasons. We have one part of the training set is the 993 sentences that were used in that were the evaluation sentences in the 2001 list evaluation. All these sentences here have four reference translations. We use as additional training data only for the ISI system. We use about 4,000 sentences from an additional multiple reference ABC corpus. One slight problem which I will talk about later, there's either 1 or 4 reference translations for this data. We use development set of 565 sentences from the same corpus, with each with 4 reference translations. And we use finally a test set, which is the same test set that the SMT team used, about 900 sentences from the last year's list. For each source sentence and each of the system, we get about between 100 and 16,000 different hypotheses generated, so different proposed translations. So that's the NBEST list that we use. And as George just explained, so the goal here is to for each of these hypotheses try to estimate whether it's correct or not. So in that setting, each proposed translation becomes one example to classify. So the numbers that we're faced with is that if we use the 100 NBEST list with our training data, we have about 500,000 training example. If we use 1,000 NBEST, we have about 5 million, and so on. So, learning from large size data. So basically, the problem we face with is that when we have more than about 5 million examples in our setting, the data will not fit in memory. So we can't do simple things like loading the examples in memory and select them at random. We can't even do that, and that's a bit annoying, because that's exactly what we need to do for most of the training most of the models that we have used. So we have implemented a technique of disk caching the data on disk, and basically this technique consists in just loading sequentially the data in the cache and then unloading randomly. So these experiments here presented in this graph were made by Alex to demonstrate the technique, and basically they show the classification error as a function of the size of the cache on the axis here, and each of these bars here corresponds to about one NBEST list. So we see that once the cache is about 3 to 4 source sentences in size, so about 3 to 4 NBEST lists, then we get approximately the same performance. So we get enough randomness by this technique to get the asymptotic performance.
This is classification error of...
This is classification error of this in this setting. Each example has to be classified either correct or incorrect.
So the thing here is, if you get a cache miss, you don't do anything about it. It's not like you go to disk and fetch it.
No, this is for the training part. So when we train the models, we need to basically we need to go through the data set and inspect each example and adapt the model accordingly, right? So we have to go through the entire data set, but we need to do that efficiently. We need to see the example sort of at random. And when you can't fit, yes.
There's a very simple technique where you keep a little cache, and then with the probability of 1 over n,
Yes.
where n is the number of elements that you have seen so far, you replace the stuff in the cache with the next item on the disk, and then you guarantee that you will have a random element after the iteration.
Okay, I think I explained clearly what this is about. This is only for the training, right? So for training, we need to see all the, let's say, 80 million examples. We need to see them all in random order, right? So we can't do that because we can't even reshuffle them, right?
Now you can keep an array of 80 million bits, and you mark
Yes.
the ones that you have seen, and then you keep a cache of 1. And then you say, okay, is the next one going to replace the one in the cache with a probability of 1/2?
How are you gonna get them? I mean, it's going to take forever if you have random access in your file. I mean, I don't know. Maybe we can discuss this. So the idea is that using a fairly small cache, we can sort of get enough randomness in the order of the training examples, so that we get useful results. Another problem we had a look at is the use of compression, processing from compressed data, and we started the workshop using BZIP, which is implementation of Spoofman compression. When we did the experiment, we saw that even though we gain, we use this because it gives a better compression ratio, but we quickly realized that by sacrificing about 50% in compressed size, we could get up to 10 times the speed improvement. So that was a very important practical issue, because that in practice that could mean just loading one file and processing the n-best list could go from 2 hours to about 2 minutes. So finally, the last thing that we did in order to also optimize this idea that we had to do out-of-core processing the data from the disk directly, is to do parallel processing of the models. So these are like 3 constraints that we had on our processing, and that means that that has the effect that not all the machine learning techniques that we would have liked to use may be practical in this setting. In particular, algorithms that have large complexity in terms of the number of examples are impossible to use in our setting. So that's, for example, why we couldn't. There was no way basically we could use algorithms like SVMs for our discriminative task. Also, algorithm memorizing large number of examples, like kernelized version of the Perceptron algorithm, were not really practical, because we would have to go through all the support vectors every time we want to do a probability estimation. So these things are bad. So what's good, what we need to use is algorithms that basically run in linear time and use a constant RAM space. Okay, so so how we use the machine learning for turning how we use machine learning techniques for addressing this estimation of correctness probability. So basically, what we want to learn, like George explained, is a probability that a sentence is correct. So C is the correctness indicator, like typically a binary variable. We want to estimate the probability that it's correct given the data. One problem is, as George also mentioned, that the correctness of the machine translation output is generally difficult to assess for a large number of data. So of course you could here you could insert your standard joke about MT being always incorrect, but that's not really the point. So for large amount of data, we don't get some very good idea of whether the translations are correct. But we may use some automatic scores. So in these experiments, in most of the experiments that we have been using, we have thresholded on 2 scores. One is the word error rate in a variant where you normalize by the length of the Levenstein alignment. So not by the reference sentence length, but by the length of total alignment. And the other one is a sentence level NIST score. So I insist on the fact that these 2 scores that we use are both used on sentence level, not document level. Of course, the question, and the biggest, one of the 2 problems we face is whether these measures would agree with human correctness. And that's something that we will talk a bit more about in the evaluation section. Another issue with using these correctness score but just thresholding automatic scores is the influence of the number of reference translations. So when we use more reference translations, automatically the scores will tend to increase and the word error rates will tend to decrease. And this is exemplified here in this distribution, and we see the distribution of the NIST scores for all the sentences in the training corpus that have 1 reference, for the sentences in the training corpus that have 4 references, and for the sentences that have 11 references. Okay. And we see that there's some very systematic effect, and the entire distribution of the score just shifts up as the number of reference translation increases. And this has some very undesirable effect, because if we look here these curves, red and blue curve, represent the probability that an example is below a given NIST threshold. So if we want to use as a threshold, we want to use, for example, NIST score of 5. That means that on the training set, we have about 50% correct, 50% incorrect examples. On the test set, we have less than 10% incorrect and 90% incorrect. There's a very large imbalance.
Because the test set is a different number of references.
Yes, the test set is all 4 references, and the training set is all a mix of different number of reference translations. So there's one easy fix to this is use only for the sentences with 11 references, use only the 4 first references. So you sort of put this distribution back into this range here. And for the sentences with only 1 references, which are actually about 3/4 of our training corpus, we had to devise a scaling scheme that would sort of help match the distribution of the score across the entire data set. Okay. So the one model that we use for estimating this correctness probability is a simple knife-based model. So it's a generative model with where the features are assumed independent. So the posterior class probability that we're interested in is just estimated as the product of the probability for each of the features. I sort of dropped normalization factor here, but we need to normalize it to be a true probability. This was done for continuous features. This was done by discretizing the features into about 20 bins and treating these features as discrete. So treating the probability as discrete probability. And parameter estimation is basically done in 2 passes over the training set, so it's fairly efficient with respect to all these constraints I mentioned earlier. The class conditional probability estimates are computed by using a smoothing of the empirical frequencies. The smoothing technique is described in a paper by Alberto at this year's ICASP conference. Byproduct of this of the overall knife-based model is that if we want to estimate the importance of an individual feature, we can do that directly by computing the performance of the classifier, a probabilistic classifier that uses basically only this feature as input, and the parameters are already estimated. So we get that for free. Second model that we used during these experiments is multi-layer perceptron. So basically a discriminative model that uses a linear transformation of the output, a non-linear transformation, and then a linear transformation again in the output layer. So we have a set of parameters that here is trained by minimizing the empirical loss using a gradient descent technique. One attractive thing is that the gradient of all continuously differentiable losses are estimated easily using this backpropagation technique. And with large data sets like we had, we use stochastic gradient descent to minimize the empirical loss. And basically, for each example that we saw, so each example in random order, we update the model parameter by a small quantity that's proportional to the gradient. And in this context, it's very important that the examples are presented in random order. So that was one of the motivations of this cache technique. Because if we present for example, if we present all the examples in the order they are in the training set, we'll see all the proposals for the same source sentence, so it's sort of tend to overfit each source sentence in turn. So for large amount of data and very redundant data, so our data is very dependent because and hypotheses in the same endless list tend to be very dependent. So for large amount of data and redundant data, stochastic gradient descent can actually be quite efficient. In terms of training, we also used early stopping and multiple initialization to minimize the risk of getting stuck in a local minimum. Okay, quickly I will go over the relationship with maximum entropy. So maximum entropy, heard a lot about this morning. So the probabilities model as basically a log linear model involving some features that depend on the output and the input. Single layer perceptron. So perceptron here, without this nonlinear transfer function, is basically also a log linear model involving the inputs. So there's a clear link between the inputs that you have and the feature functions here. And for the multi-layer perceptron, you basically have, using the softmax output layer, basically have a log linear model involving a linear combination of nonlinear feature functions of the nonlinear functions of the input. So, of course, if we fix the input weights, this reduces to maxent very directly. And the idea with using this multi-layer perceptron is that we hope that we can sort of generalize the popular maxent framework to nonlinear feature combinations. Okay, so finally something a bit unrelated. In the final experimental results, we did some estimation of error bars on the performance, and for most performance measures, it's not very. You don't get a sampling distribution, so it's not very obvious how to get error bars. So we did that with a resampling approach, and the idea is that if we had all the data, so if we could generate all the possible sentences and all possible correctness evaluation, we could calculate the true performance. And usually we don't have this. We have a specific sample, and we have an estimate of the performance. And what we would like to evaluate is basically the distribution of the difference between our performance estimate and the real performance. But of course, we can't repeatedly sample and estimate real sampling distribution for this quantity. So the basic idea of the bootstrap is that you replace the true distribution of your data by the empirical distribution, and then you simulate this sampling of data from the true distribution by just basically resampling the same data with replacement. So for each resample, that's basically choosing data from the available sample, we calculate a new bootstrap performance, and according to the bootstrap principle, we replace the distribution of the actual bias that we're interested in by the distribution of the difference between the bootstrap results with the actual estimate that we have. So for error bars, basically we estimate the error bars on the bootstrap sample and translate them to the actual estimate. Okay, so that's. Oh, we're back to the outline of presentation. So I'll. Very good.
Yeah, I'm probably first.
Very good.
Okay, so I'm going to go quickly into specifically the sentence level layer of the features that we generated. After I describe the features, then George is going to go quickly into the results, and then, as you saw in the outline, Simone is going to talk about different applications, the results of applications we tried to use with those feature results. So probably about the most significant portion of time for a lot of us was brainstorming ideas for and implementing functions for the feature extraction. Part of the difference, you'll see a lot of overlap in some ways between some of the things I'm presenting and some of what the syntax group presented this morning. The biggest difference is really the motivation, whereas their motivation was for rescoring and trying to re-rank the hypotheses. We were looking more just to come up with an evaluation of whether or not it was correct, which allowed us to look more at, for example, features that dealt only with the source sentence, which really wouldn't be useful for re-ranking MT applications. The features that we generated really can be classified in a couple different ways. The first type of classification is whether or not the feature was specific to the base model, the base machine translation model used to generate the target sentences. Some of the features that we have that were specific to the model included specific methods, so maybe discussing the actual pruning that went on during the translation, or even something like the ISI system takes advantage of alignment templates, whereas another system may not use that. So a lot of the relevance here is just the idea of transferability. Some of these features that we generated for this system maybe would need to be changed or looked at in a different way for a different machine translation system. Second type of base model features just sort of describe a typical generation of target sentences. So for example, one MT system may have a different penalty on length of hypotheses. So not only will the one system have a different average hypothesis length, but that may end up correlating differently with confidence. We have to do a different type of retraining. The second type of classification, other than base model or not base model, is what the feature was dependent on. So of course, many of our features were dependent on the target sentence or some combination of the target and source sentences, alignments, and etc. But we also looked at a number of features that dealt only with the source sentence. So this is basically looking at a source sentence before any translation is done, saying, is this going to be hard to translate? A fast overview of the types of functions that we generated. 91 seemed like a large number, though 450 sort of outshone us a little bit. But 91 features was a pretty good coverage of the types of characteristics we were looking to extract. Out of those 91, 24 for the most part were taken directly from the log files that we had access to from the ISI generation of the translations. Another 13 were alignment template based, so they were based on the base model, but they weren't necessarily directly extracted from work that had been done before. And the other 34 were model independent. In the second measure, it's roughly divided into thirds. About a third of the features we generated were only looking at the source sentence, and you can see the rest of the distribution. Another difference between some of the work we did, well, first off, the most part out of the 91 features, most of them were generated for the entire depth of the NBEST list. So if there were 16,000 hypotheses, we generated features for all 16,000 of those. 9 of those were only for the top 1,000 hypotheses, though. And then another relevant fact to pull out is that for all of our features, we generated it for all 5,700 source sentence NBEST list. So we were training on the entire set and generated it for the entire set. And now I'm going to go through quickly some of the features that we use. Some will appear on the screen, and I won't mention them. If you have a question, then let me know. And also, the way I'm presenting it is roughly by the classifications, but they aren't necessarily non-overlapping classifications, so I'll bring that out as I go through it. First off, base model features. Feature scores is the 12 feature scores that were extracted directly from the base model logs that were mentioned before. So different language model cost, rule-based cost, etc. All of these features right here were extracted after the entire translation process was completed, whereas we also had a number of base model features that discuss the actual process of translation. So different NBEST lists or different source sentences had different pruning results as we went through it. Out of all of these base models, these three in red are target dependent. So there's a different number generated for each of the targets, whereas the rest, if you look through them, for each NBEST list, there was just one number that was generated and used for everything. So again, this is an example of just being based on the source sentence, where we're looking at a source sentence and the process that followed through that and saying, is it likely that this translation is going to be correct? Going to some more interesting features, we had a couple based on the alignment templates. First off, we had a couple features that dealt with consistency of the alignment. So looking at alignment templates and also words, the average number of times the alignment template or word was aligned to a certain source symbol. This is also a subsentential feature, and we'll hear more about this later, so I won't cover very much. Something that's a little bit different than what most of us think of, an alignment template n-gram language model was built and tested. So what this means is for each NBEST list, a different language model was trained. And while most of the time language model units are n-grams of words, this is actually n-grams of alignment templates, where each unit was the English side of the alignment template and then the source positions that it met in the sentence. So no smoothing was used at all. A 1 gram language model and 2 and 3 were all trained and tested separately. And then the perplexities and log probabilities, as well as a general look at the density or the vocabulary of the alignment templates divided by source and target length were all considered. Looking specifically at source-based features, a different type of language model score was calculated and trained. It was trained on the large, I believe it was the 150,000 sentence corpus that the ISI system was originally trained on. So looking at just the Chinese text, Chinese half of that parallel corpus, a trigram language model was trained. Our SRI toolkit was used using Kneser-Nye discounting for backoff, and log probabilities and complexities were determined. So this was a more clear example of looking at a source sentence and determining whether or not it was going to be difficult to translate. A second type of feature that was brought up in an earlier talk this summer and sort of generated a lot of interest, partly because it performed well, it seems to be performing well, and partly because there was a lot of questions and it was sort of vaguely explained, so I want to go a little bit further into it. The idea was that we wanted to somehow look at the source sentence and look at what the n-grams within the source sentence, were they frequent, were they not, in a way that was different than what was trained in the language model. So a quartile designation was developed. What this means pretty much, this is an example. All singleton n-grams were ignored and trained just for memory constraints. But here is about 80,000 unigram Chinese words, and they're listed in order of increasing vocabulary. I have a pointer somewhere. So the y-axis is the log of the frequency. So you can see, well, most are very low. In fact, these 3 points are the mean and the median, the lower quartile, and upper quartile. So 3/4 of the words were seen 69 or less times, whereas the high end of this goes up to 10 to the 7th. It was determined that we should divide everything into frequency ranges based on this versus trying to actually fit the data more evenly. If you look at a little bit deeper into it, these are the percentages of how often these words appeared in the training corpus, so these specific terms, whereas 99% were all seen in this highest quartile. What this sort of is showing is because the distribution is so skewed to the one side, we wanted a way to have greater granularity of classifying 3/4 of the vocabulary. Other measures such as mean, this is the mean of the distribution, which only covers about 1/10 of the vocabulary to the right-hand side. And this is the halfway point. If I were to actually try to divide all of the training sentence or all of the training words together and determine half of the words that have half of our frequency on one side and the other half on the other side, it's less than 1% of the vocabulary is contained in that. So that was, this is a measure, this quartile measure was used for unigrams, bigrams, and trigrams and did pretty well. Going a little more quickly, this is just like the alignment template language model that we saw before, only this is on words. So again, there's no smoothing. 1, 2, and 3 grams were all trained separately and had separate language models, and scores were used. This is again SRI Toolkit language model trained on the English half of the corpus in order to say or determine whether or not the target sentence was a likely sentence. Some other target-based features. We have several word features generated averaged over the full sentence, which Nicola will talk more about. Something more interesting was center hypotheses that were extracted. So this was done using a Levenstein distance between all of the top 1,000 hypotheses for each n-best list. So every hypothesis was compared to all of the other hypotheses without any regard to rank or base model score. And then once a center hypothesis, which means a hypothesis that already existed but is the smallest average distance from all the others, once that was determined, then the distance of all the hypotheses from that center was used as a feature, as well as a slightly different metric which looked at, when comparing each hypothesis to all of the others, which hypotheses were very close to many of them. So maybe they didn't have the lowest average at a distance, but they were often seen very close to some, and maybe there's a couple that were a larger deviation that threw off the hypothesis. We actually generated several files of what the sentences based on this would look like, and the blue score improved a seemingly significant bit. So we hope that this metric would capture some of that. Alignment monotonicity we looked at before, or we heard about this morning. That's just the number of times that there was some type of swap in the alignment versus left or right. We also use Model 1 scores. Care of Kenji for his help on that. So we trained both, we used 2 models, one that was Chinese to English, one that was English to Chinese. And we basically determined, based on Model 1 bag of words model, the probability of the target sentence given the source and the probability of the source sentence if we are translating it from the target. Finally, the last feature I'm going to discuss is also both source and target based. It deals with alignments. And this is probably one of the more interesting and controversial and unfortunately not very effective features that we put together. John worked on this, and this is the idea of semantic similarity. So this is also for only the top 1,000 hypotheses. And the idea was to try to see how close semantically all of the hypotheses were to the top couple of hypotheses, to see if maybe there was some type of synonym used or switched that maybe affected the score, but in general it still carried the idea that we were trying to represent. The first measure is just basically talking about the vocabulary of alignments through the n-best list. The second, or the next couple measures, all use WordNet to estimate the semantic similarity based on work done by Banduri and Peterson. So here's a fast example of what that looks like. So here's a Chinese sentence, and we've seen all of these sentences pretty often by this point, but I'll go through them again. So here's, this is the top ranking Chinese sentence, and this is another one, I'm not sure, somewhere lower in the list. So each source word, which you sort of space delimited, each source word is aligned to different words in the target sentences. So you can see there's some crossing in different places, and there's some words that are aligned to multiple target words and some target words aligned to multiple source words, but this is all kind of captured here. So for every source word, for example right here, we looked at which target words were directly aligned with that source word. So in this case, we have China and apostrophe S and China apostrophe S. And then a semantic or a similarity score was calculated between all words in that cluster of words. So for example, cities and cities economic, a score was found between cities and cities and economic, and eventually some type of semantic score for all of the source words, source word alignments was calculated. We then averaged those or combined them in different ways and came up with scores, and we hoped that that would sort of get to some of the meat of different hypotheses that were semantically related versus others. Any questions?
Okay, some results. So this is for the sentence level problem, and we're evaluating independent of any task. And we're trying to answer three types of questions, basically. Which features work best? How hard are different error measures and thresholds to learn? So we used basically 4 different problems here. We have NIST as our error threshold, and then we're using it at a 5% level. So a NIST threshold level that classifies 5% of our training corpus as correct. And we also did, so this is trying to sort of to capture translations that are reasonable for use in gisting. And you get the basic idea from these translations. And then we also used a 30% threshold, so a threshold that classifies 30% of our corpus as correct. And this is going to be more like a kind of a keyword correct level. And we did the same thing, roughly equivalent for word error rate. So we have these 4 different problems, basically, that we're trying to solve. And we also are trying to figure out which machine learning methods work best. So we compare just raw features versus our 2 machine learning methods that Cyril described, regression versus classification, and some normalization that I'll talk about in a bit. Okay, so here's our test corpus. It's the 993 test corpus that Cyril described earlier. Actually, the results I'm going to present are only over 1,000 best lists. So here's how the test corpus matches the train corpus down here. So where this threshold gave us 5% of the training corpus, the same threshold, correct, the same threshold gives us 3.2% on our test corpus. The NIST threshold gave us 30% on the training corpus and 32%. So the matches are fairly close in all cases, except for this 3.2%. So that's a fairly different regime. And we use 2 different metrics to evaluate our performance. ROC and this AROC measure, which is basically a kind of a normalized integral under an ROC curve, so it's between 0 and 1, and it's nice to compare. And then negative log likelihood for probability estimates. Okay, so here are our 5 best features for each of these 4 different problems. This is NIST at 5%, word error rate at 5%, NIST at 30%, word error rate at 30%. So what can we extract from this? Well, model 1, the bold numbers here are significantly different from the next best feature. So model 1, no surprise, did quite well in 2 of these, and I think in the other lists it was fairly close as well. The alignment template engrams also did well from one of the problems, and they were good in general. Most, I guess, except for model 1, all of these features are dependent on the base model. So you have these search features, and these were extracted from search logs from the base model, and they kind of get at how hard the base model thought the source sentence was to translate. So we captured things like pruning and so forth. So these all did very well. And this was the actual score of the baseline model. So for at least a couple of these settings, this did well as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so the 44.9, these are
Yeah.
classification errors?
These are this AROC. So it's the area underneath the ROC curve, and then we just because that
Oh, yeah.
we transform it, and it's on a scale from, and I've multiplied it by 100, so it's from 0 to 100%, if you like. Okay, so these are the results for AROC in terms of discriminability. Here are estimates. This is negative log likelihood, so the smaller the better here. This is bits. And these were using single feature naive Bayes models. So basically we exploited the histogram to give us a bit of smoothing here. And you see more or less the same thing, with the exception of model 1, which I think has dropped out here. But the alignment template n-grams are still here, and a lot of the search features. And I think, apart from, I think all of these top 5 features are derived directly from the base model. So these tended to be, the base model contains a lot of information about how well it's doing.
What's the difference between these scores and all the previous boiling?
Okay, so these scores were just, we took the individual feature and we used it to rank all hypotheses. And then we just computed how well that ranking corresponded to our actual correct or incorrect classification. These ones, we built a probabilistic model for correctness and calculated cross entropy on the classifications. Okay, so those are individual features. Now I'm trying to synthesize which classes of features did best. So this is the classification that Aaron described. So we have here whether the feature is based on the base model or not, and here whether it depended on the source sentence, the target sentence, or both. So really, there's tons of numbers here. The ones to pay attention to are the ones in blue. So these are the aggregates over how well, on average, source sentence features did, how well target sentence features did, how well base model features did, and how well ones not based on the base model did. So the physical layout of this is the same as the other slides. This is NIST at 5%. This is NIST at 30%. Word error rate at 5. Word error rate at 30. So what you see in general, if you look at these numbers for a while, is that it confirms what I mentioned in the last slide. The base model tends to do better. Features based on the base model tend to do better than those not. And features, it's less distinct pattern, but features that take only the source sentence into account tend to do quite well. So this is kind of interesting because this means we can discard, we're just interested in saying of a source sentence, we can't possibly get a correct translation for this source sentence that with this current technology.
Just give up in advance.
Give up in advance, yeah, right. Although, I mean, sometimes we need the model to tell us that we should give up in advance. So we give up afterwards. And a similar table for the negative log likelihood. And the results are pretty comparable across these two. Okay, so how do these 4 different problems compare? Which are easiest to learn? So these are sort of average results over a whole bunch of different neural net configurations for 1,000 best lists. So NIST, the NIST scores are slightly higher than the word error rate. So these seem to be easier to learn, and they seem to be more consistent as you go from 5 to 30. So NIST is probably a nicer measure to learn. Machine learning evaluation. We tried a feature normalization on a source sentence basis. So we have a lot of features that exhibit a lot of variability between different source sentences. The base model score is 1. So if you have a long source sentence, the scores will tend to be lower than a short one, for instance. So what we wanted to do is say, well, we'll compare all source sentences equally. We'll take all these features that kind of have varying scales among different source sentences, and we'll normalize them and use them in a normalized way. this turned out to be a really bad idea. So here are the results for the normalized versions, and here are the results for the non-normalized version. In almost every case, there's quite a large increase you get from the plain non-normalized version. So this fits with the idea of just basing your estimates on the source sentence. We also tried an experiment where we used regression instead of classification. So up to now, we've been describing classifiers based on a 0 or 1 tag using a threshold, but of course we can also try to learn the error function directly with regression and then apply the threshold afterwards. And it's not too surprising. These are the regression results. This does worse than classification because the classifier has a chance to learn the specific threshold. The regression you have to kind of learn the behavior of the error function over a lot of different thresholds. We were also interested in knowing whether using additional hidden units in the neural net would give us an advantage over using none. So none is essentially maximum entropy. Unfortunately for this problem, we don't really get a gain by using additional hidden units. This may be due to, it may be due to small data in the sense of having a fairly small number of source sentences, although we have enormous data in terms of the number of hypotheses we consider. We're not sure yet why this is. It's not overfitting. We control that very carefully. Oops. I'm backing up here. Yeah, it was up. Okay, the obligatory ROC curve. So the resolution is not the greatest on this, but here are 3 different confidence techniques. This wiggly line here is the worst. This is the base model score on its own. This line here is the alignment template n-gram, which was the best on this trial, this configuration that we're testing here. And this is our best neural net result. So you see there's a significant difference between the model that was trained on all the features and the individual features on their own. And this pretty much carries, this obtains across all the experiments we tried. So in general, using a machine learning layer on top of the baseline model is a good idea. I'll turn over to Simona.
I'm just wondering, do you have, I couldn't tell, this is the composite of all 91 features that top curve?
Yes, that's right.
And is there similar behavior like you heard this morning where like the first feature gets you 90% of the way and everything else sort of?
I don't know. We didn't try those experiments. We just trained. So far, all we've done is single feature models or the whole thing. But I think at the sub-sentence level, Nicola will talk about some experiments using naive Bayes.
Well, you do have ROC curves for single feature.
We have single, yes, we do
Are
have.
they, each one of those substantially worse than the top curve?
Yes, yes.
So you're getting some additivity.
Oh yes, we're getting, yeah, I don't think it's that same curve. It would be interesting to plot it, but I suspect our curve is smoother and more deep.
All right. So this is the last section about sentence level experiments that we've done. So you've seen lots of numbers, you've seen the descriptions of all our features, and you've seen task-independent evaluations. What I'd like to do now is to speak about the concrete applications that we implemented in order to try the usability of these confidence measures. Now, the 2 applications that we tried are view rankings over n-best lists from 2 separate systems. One is the ISI SMT system that was provided, the n-best provided by the SMT, and one was by the CMU system. Both systems were generated n-best for the training purpose over the 993 sentences and provided for the NIST 2001 competition, and we only used the top 1,000 n-best translations. For the testing, we used the 878 sentences from the 2002 NIST evaluation on both n-best, on both systems. And the second application was model combination, where we basically tried to implement some combination voting scheme that would hopefully try to pick the best translations coming from compare the two translations coming from the two different systems and pick the best one systematically. I would like to emphasize from the beginning that even though these applications were readily available, you had all the data, and so they were easy to implement, they from the beginning were not what we the most possibly appropriate ones. And the reason for this being that first of all, confidence estimation, the way we implemented it, looks at features that try to capture the difficulty of the probability of correctness of the sentence, and very often these features are not appropriate to discriminate between, to rank translation alternatives from the best to the worst, but they capture the intrinsic difficulty of the translation. So basically, we did not expect to have very great re-ranking results. The second thing that I would like to outline again, I think by the end of this talk you will all be familiar with the two big problems in confidence estimation for MT, is this definition of goodness. We heavily rely on being able to identify a translation or a part of a translation as being correct or wrong, much more so than MT. So some of these choices that you made on defining correct as being a translation that is above a certain threshold on any of these many evaluation metrics, well, it turns the problem into much more difficult one to do. So, some results. This is the re-ranking experiments that we did with the base model ISI system. What you see here is the performance of the baseline system over different metrics. This is the global blue. This is the global NIST. This is an average per sentence NIST, and this is average per sentence word error rate, and this is slightly modified normalized version. The second line is the re-ranking results that we obtained by using an MLP that was trained on a threshold over NIST. The threshold we chose was the one that split the training purpose into a 30% correct one and not. So these are basically what this basically says is that if we do re-ranking by choosing systematically the hypothesis that has the highest confidence score, we lose in global blue, but this is no surprise. Per sentence confidence measure should not port over to global blue. Neither do they for global NIST. They, however, slightly increase the average per sentence NIST of the corpus, but these results are not statistically significant, and they do not modify the percentage word error rate. Now, if we choose a different confidence estimation model and one that was trained using thresholds over word error rate, then the global blue decreases even more. The global NIST also, we do worse on, we do slightly better, but it's statistically, it's about the same than on average per sentence NIST. And to our big surprise and our big disappointment, we do not obtain any improvement either on the average per sentence word error rate. To compare these results, we also ran some oracle that chose systematically the best per sentence NIST, the translation which had the highest per sentence NIST score, and then one that chose systematically one with the lowest word error rate, and we see that not even those results, because they are per sentence scores, do not reflect any global improvements over the base model blue results. However, they do increase quite significantly the average per sentence NIST and word error rate of the corpus. So we would have hoped to be somewhere closer towards the oracle line in these columns. And the reason why we're not remains to be investigated. It might be due to some overfitting problems that we had. We tried to dramatically increase the learning rate. We reduced the complexity of our model. We basically did this with the linear model with 0 hidden units, and we still did not obtain very positive results. Now for the same thing for the CMU SMT system. The difference between the two were that the confidence models on the ISI system were trained over the full training corpus of meaning 5,000 something sentences, however only the top 5,000. Whereas here we only used the 993 training corpus. So we see that we don't obtain not even any slightly significant improvement here. We actually decrease even in average per sentence word error rate and average per sentence NIST. Once again, because we had less training data, this might be another more perverse side effect of this overfitting problem that we have noticed. However, what is interesting to note here is that if we obtain the global non-significant increase in the blue score, but it's not significant. And what is interesting is though is to see that the oracle per sentence NIST or per sentence word error rate solutions are significantly higher than the baseline model, which was not the case for the ISI system. And the reason for this is that this system was specifically trained to optimize global blue, whereas the other one wasn't. So actually, basically this means that we cannot try to beat the system on blue. It was optimized to do so. Okay, model comparison. We have these two systems that produce translations, and this both two lists of n-bests, and we would like to try to find the best solution coming from the combined best lists by looking at them separately, in the hope that once one of the systems sometimes is wrong, the other one would hopefully have a better answer, so that they not be wrong both in the same, always at the same time. So once again, the baseline of the system was just picking the top solution coming from the two systems on a maximum base score voting scheme. So just look at the base model probabilities, pick the one with the highest probability and take it. Well, this is a completely meaningless experiment because the scales of the probabilities of the two systems are incomparable. The ISI system has systematically higher probability estimates, so this baseline actually is the ISI system. What we then did, we normalized the base scores. We said, okay, so if the base scores are not comparable, let's normalize them and do this voting scheme based on normalized scores. What we obtained then is a significant decrease over global blue and over all the other metrics because the CMU system is much worse, so which tend to drag the CMU system, the ISI system down. Then we implemented this voting scheme based on the confidence estimation layer that had been trained over NIST thresholding, and we see that we're doing a little bit better than the normalized base score, but we still degrade the baseline performance. We did the same with the confidence estimation NLP trained over word error rate thresholding, and it was even better than the NIST, but it still degraded the baseline performance. And then we ran some oracles. So we said, let's say we can determine which of the two hypotheses proposed by the two systems has the highest percentage NIST or the lowest percentage word error rate. And what we actually see is that even if we would have done this, we would not increase over the baseline system as far as global blue is concerned. However, we would have been able to increase at the average percentage NIST or the average percentage word error rate basis. So we would have hoped to be with these two values somewhere closer to the oracle values. It was not the case, and this was again another disappointing result. So basically here, I'm here to tell you that these experiments didn't work, but this does not mean that the whole thing is completely useless, because we were able to get this discriminability improvement as showed by George previously. And the difficulties for this task are due to the difficulty of defining what is the correct translation or not. Secondly, the applications that we chose are obviously not the most appropriate ones. And what we would like to try out in the future would be to try to investigate better per sentence level SMT evaluation metrics, try to look at different confidence features and ML approaches, confidence features that would look at consensus over hypothesis and word lattices, and try to filter to find more appropriate applications. And that resumes the first part of our talk. And we have a break. Unless you have questions.
So we'll be back at 1:45.